Chapter 3, Genesis Chapter 1, Yahweh is better. When read through ancient eyes, the beginning of Genesis is actually quite dramatic, though we might be too familiar with the story to see it that way. Christians are trained to think that Genesis begins this way. God made a ball of cosmic Play-Doh appear out of nowhere. Poof! But that doesn't sound like what's happening here in Genesis 1. And it doesn't sound like the type of story the ancient Israelites would tell about how their God creates. Now, it's true that some New Testament passages like Colossians chapter 1 verse 16 and Hebrews chapter 11 verse 3, perhaps under the influence of Greek ways of thinking, mention God creating something out of nothing. On the other hand, 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 5 talks about creation in more of an ancient Israelite way. The earth was formed out of water and by means of water. So, right away, in the first two verses of Genesis, we have to work hard to leave the modern world behind to figure out exactly what is happening. In the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was chaotic, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Despite the words, in the beginning, it feels like we are walking in on the middle of something. And that's because we are. We do not begin with a whole lot of nothing, as we might have been taught, but with an earth that is empty and a mysterious deep, which we find out is the same thing as the waters at the end of the passage. Confused? Now, you can see why we spent so much time hammering home that this is an ancient story written by and to the Israelites. If it is written by and to the Israelites, we need to see it from their point of view. So, if you are going to understand this story, we have to suspend our 21st century views of the universe, science, and history and enter their world. If their world seems strange, just try it on and wear it for a few minutes, even if it makes you feel a little insecure. Because what we find is that this new, strange way of seeing the opening of Genesis would have made perfect sense in the ancient world. Chaos has a rough week. No stories of creation in the ancient world start with nothing and go to something. These ancient storytellers simply didn't seem interested in how the universe got here, at least not in any scientific sense. Actually, they weren't thinking of a universe at all, but of the cosmos, as we shall see in a moment. We might be tempted to ask, where did this desolate earth and deep come from if God didn't create them out of nothing? The answer from Genesis chapter 1? Silence, interrupted by chirping crickets. We aren't told. Get used to it. We'll get that answer a lot. Instead, this story focuses on the earth being chaotic, or as some translations say, a formless void, and the water seems to have something to do with why. The Hebrew phrase for formless void is tohu bohu, which is not a new elitist foodie food group, but two Hebrew words that have been combined to make a word that has actually made it into English. We're not kidding. Look it up. Tohu means formless, and bohu means empty. In English, the phrase has come to mean something utterly chaotic, and when we use the word chaos instead of nothing for what we find at the beginning of Genesis, we are beginning to understand the ancient mindset about how God creates. In the ancient world of biblical times, the gods did not create out of nothing. The world looks the way it does because the gods tamed chaos. Genesis is Israel's story about who is truly responsible. The uniqueness of Israel's God in an ancient mindset is not that God creates out of nothing, but in the swift, invincible power God displays in overcoming chaos, working solo in the span of a work week. Israel's story stands in stark contrast to the stories of Israel's neighbors, as we will see in a moment. So, how does God tame the chaos? First, where there is no form, tohu, God will make habitable ordered space. And where there is emptiness, bohu, God will fill it. On days 1 through 3, God creates space. And days 4 through 6, God fills the space. The whole chapter is structured as an answer to the formless void problem we see in verses 1 and 2. When we see the opening scene of Genesis in this way, we find that the 6 days of creation make a bit of sense. They aren't about how God created the universe out of nothing or an allegory for evolution. Instead, these days display for us the creative act of Israel's God ordering the chaos. Imagine that it's game night at your house and your family wants to play Monopoly. But, much to your chagrin, the kitchen table is stacked with junk mail, backpacks, old snacks, grocery lists, and some sticky stuff left over from breakfast. You can't play until you make room for the board, and stacks of money, and a place for you all to sit. So you start to work, systematically clearing off the mess so you can get ready to play. You're not playing yet. You've just created the space. And after you've done all this preparation, you are ready to put things in their place. Board goes here, money goes there, pieces go here, some room for snacks and drinks, and you all take your proper place around the table so you can begin playing. This is similar to what is happening in Genesis chapter 1. God puts things in order, days 1 through 3, before setting up the game and playing, days 4 through 6. If we begin Genesis with a cluttered kitchen table, the dark, churning ocean and nothing else, the deep. And we ask ourselves, how in the world is God going to create the beauty we see in the world today out of this mess? And, just like family game night, on days 1 through 3 of creation, God orders the chaos by creating space for something new. And then, on days 4 through 6, God puts down the pieces in this newly created space. On day 1, God creates a space for the sun, moon, and stars by separating the light from the dark. Notice, he doesn't create the sun, moon, and stars, the things that actually give us light, until day 4. Actually, the moon reflects light, but the Israelites didn't know that. On day 1, God is still clearing off the table so that there is room for the sun, moon, and stars on day 4. That is, God is creating order out of chaos, so that on day 4, God can fill this newly created space with sun, moon, and stars. On day 2, God creates a space for birds and sea creatures, basically things that don't need dry land in the ancient mind. By separating the waters from above from the waters below with what is called a firmament, or in some translation, an expanse or dome. We will see in a moment how we should think of this firmament, but for now, the important thing is that God does this so that on day 5, God can fill this newly created space with sea creatures and birds. Then, on day 3, God moves the oceans to the side to allow dry land to appear, so that on day 6, God can create land animals, and finally, humans. On days 1 through 3, God clears off the table, and on days 4 through 6, he sets up the game. That is the overall picture painted for us in Genesis 1. We begin with chaos, with tohu bohu, and by the time we get to the end of the chapter, we have air, land, and sea, and all those things that fill those spaces. Chaos is ordered, and the cosmos is filled. God has done God's work with little effort in 6 days. Now that we have the big picture down, here are a few details that the storyteller wants his readers to see. A reminder to Israel and a slap in the face to everyone else, especially the Babylonians. Remember in the first chapter where we mentioned that Genesis sometimes has a Babylonian feel to it? If Genesis was indeed shaped largely as a response to Israel's trauma in Babylon, we shouldn't be surprised to find hints of that here and there, with maybe a jab or two taken at their captors in the process. For example, Israel's Babylonian captors were big on astrology, and the sun, moon, and stars might have been gods, though scholars are not certain about that. What is clear is that the heavenly bodies were thought to tell the future to those skilled enough to know how to read them. But for the Israelites, the heavenly bodies served no such function. Instead, they were for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. In verse 14. That means they were passive agents that served God by marking time, not by predicting what is to come. In fact, though this takes a bit from the focus of this book, the time that the heavenly bodies mark is not when winter begins or when it's time to go to bed. They mark the time of Israel's liturgical year. Season is the same word used in the Pentateuch to refer to the appointed times of Israel's religious festivals, commanded by God. One example is Exodus chapter 23, verse 15. In other words, the heavenly bodies are put into place by God to keep track of how the Israelites are to worship God. Compared to what the Babylonians and other ancient peoples thought, Israel's God knocked the heavenly bodies down to size. Another knock on the Babylonians and other religions is that Israel's God works solo. In the Babylonian story Enuma Elish, which has a lot in common with the creation story in Genesis, we have a soap opera instead. The god Marduk has a long-standing grievance with his great-grandmother Tiamat. Apparently, this dysfunctional divine family didn't believe in counseling, so they settled their differences by Marduk cutting Tiamat in half, actually filleting her top to bottom. With half of her body, he makes the barrier to separate the waters, the firmament of Genesis. But Israel's God is the great and mighty God. God created the cosmos solo and effortlessly, no debate and no battle, while the Babylonian creation story looks like a Jerry Springer episode. Also, humans are created as God's crowning achievement. It is only following day 6 that God declares that what he has made very good, not simply good as in previous days. That's because humans bear God's likeness and image. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. In the ancient world, kings would put images of themselves in the remote parts of their kingdom so that their subjects would know that he is still there, even if he is far away. Also, kings were considered divine image bearers, governing the people in God's place. In Genesis chapter 1, however, all humans have the same royal status. They represent God in the world by ruling over all of creation in God's place. God blessed humans and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. In fact, Humanity's status is so high that later, well, after the Babylonian exile, Jews wrote stories about how angry the angels were that humans were given such status that rivaled their own. This is even hinted at in the Bible itself. What are mere mortals that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the heavenly beings, angels, and crowned them with glory and honor. Psalm chapter 8, verses 4 and 5. This does not sound like other creation stories of the ancient world. In the Babylonian creation story, humans are not made in God's image. In one story called the Epic of Atrocities, humans are created as an afterthought to do the grunt work the gods are too good for or are simply too lazy to do. The elevation of humans as a whole, male and female, to the level of divine image bearer is an ancient Israelite comment on human equality. Maybe being captive in a foreign country gave them a clearer sense of the value of human life. Genesis chapter 1 is an ancient statement of faith that the God of Israel alone is worthy of Israel's worship. As tempting as it may have been to follow the gods of the stronger nations, Genesis chapter 1 puts the brakes on and says that this one God of a captive people is responsible for taming chaos and filling the air, sea, and earth. Such faith would encourage the Israelites to remain faithful to God, even when the outlook wasn't that good. In other words, Genesis chapter 1 was not written to answer our curiosity about how the universe came to be. It was not written in code to show us that the Israelites had a basic grasp of the Big Bang, the expanding universe, and Einstein's theory of relativity. Obviously, no ancient person would have understood those notions. Rather, it was written to tell the Israelites that their God, not the gods of the other nations, was the chaos tamer, and therefore this God, and this God alone, was worthy of worship. And they made this point in ancient terms, using ancient ways of thinking. When the Babylonians told stories about angry gods conspiring against each other and cutting each other in half, the Israelites did not respond, "Oh, you Babylonians and your silly stories. Don't you know all this talk about the gods is just plain primitive? Don't you know that there really is no solid structure above the earth keeping the water at bay? Don't you know that the stars are actually billions of light years away, that the earth is a round ball and revolves around the sun, and that the universe is expanding at an amazing rate? Really, get with it." Instead, the Israelites used the view of the universe they shared with their contemporaries to make a unique declaration of faith. Our God, regardless of what you might think of us, a captured people, is not weak. God is, in fact, stronger than all your gods put together. Later, in the Exodus story, we will see one other rallying cry for the Israelites. Not only is God the creator, but God is the deliverer too. Yahweh as creator and deliverer are the two things that marked Israel's God off from all other gods. And this is why God alone could expect Israel's undivided devotion. This is why worshiping the gods of other nations was as bad a thing as the Israelites could do, even if people of other nations change gods like we change phone companies. Genesis chapter 1 makes the case that abandoning Israel's God was to abandon the Creator God's self. Cut the Israelites some slack. Sometimes, modern readers of Genesis 1 think the story is a quaint relic of a silly ancient culture. Others think that Genesis chapter 1 has to be scientifically and historically accurate because it is part of the Bible. Both ways of thinking sell the Bible short. Genesis chapter 1 describes the cosmos in ancient terms, which shouldn't be hard for us to accept since the book was written by and for ancient Israelites. One good example of how Genesis reflects an ancient view of the world occurs on day number 2, when God creates the sky. But this isn't any sky we've ever experienced. This sky is apparently solid. The firmament we mentioned earlier. It is a vault or dome of some sort that separates the waters above the vault from the waters below. Think of trying to set up a flattened tent during a torrential, chaotic downpour. To get some shelter, you wiggle inside and lie flat. And then, after some struggling, you prop up the roof with one big pole in the middle, then slightly shorter ones around the edge. Because of the tent roof, you are now in a safe, enclosed bubble, protected from the waters above. Another hopefully helpful visual is to think of the sky here as the glass dome of a snow globe if the snow globe was dunked in a tub of water. The glass dome separates the waters above from the waters below, leaving a habitable space for life. Similarly, this dome keeps the waters above from crashing down and reintroducing chaos to where God has created order. And in the stories we find in Jonah, Job, and the Psalms, this snow globe is kept from floating around aimlessly in the deep by the pillars or mountains of the earth, or, to go back to our other metaphor, ancient tent poles. Here, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, God creates this vault to put the chaotic waters in their place, so to speak, so order can arise. If more visuals would help, take a minute and Google Ancient Near East Cosmology. Remember that reading this story through ancient eyes means forgetting about telescopes, complicated charts of outer space, and Einstein. What you could see is what you got. And if we didn't have modern technology, thinking of the world as a giant snow globe isn't a bad place to start. The earth looked to ancient Israelites like a flat disk, and high above was what looked like a rounded dome that began and ended on the horizons. The great expanse above is also blue, the color of water, and so it was thought that the dome was holding water back. Below the earth was more water, and everything seemed to be held up by mountains off in the distant horizon. It's really inconceivable that Genesis would open up anything other than an ancient view of the world. Not only would a science textbook be dull, it would also have been literal nonsense to the readers of the Bible for a few thousand years. Remember, the point of an ancient story is to tell a story, not to inform us of the mechanics of the universe. At the same time, we have to give the Israelites a lot of credit for producing such a literary gem that still holds trained Bible readers captive 2,500 years later. The opening chapter of the Bible is not just slapped together like a last-minute term paper. The story is subtle, challenging, and artistically composed. The theology is deep, and against the ancient backdrop, staggering. This stands to reason. Storytellers, not historians, scientists, or academics, produced this book. Our world would be a much poorer place if we pointed out all the ways in which J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth doesn't measure up to our modern ways of seeing the world. We have all experienced that annoying friend who keeps saying things like, "Oh, brother, that would never happen in real life," during movies. Such a friend is missing the point. Side note, if you haven't experienced that annoying friend, you probably are that annoying friend. Stories are not waiting to be molded to fit our experience. They are waiting for us to take the risk of entering their world of the story and be changed by it. With that thought, we leave the first chapter of the Bible very much aware that we have only scratched the surface of things. But to read Genesis chapter 1 as an ancient story of Israelite faith amid trying times is a great place to start, and it is necessary preparation for reading the rest of Genesis.